All right, so I'm going to, at this point, I want to go into some Q&A. So for questions that I can see here, so Dan, the question is, I'm going to pass it to you, is what happens if I don't do any of this?
This is a question that I used to get. I don't get it as often as much anymore. However, let me just give a little history about the whole MIL-STD 130. It first started in 2004. And quite frankly, for the first decade, the government was fairly lax in the enforcement of this policy. However, I've seen in the last couple of years that more audits are being done and compliance checks are being done so that people are following the compliance requirement. But let's just say you see it in your contract, you see MIL-STD 130 in there, and you know how you have a requirement for these IUID labels, and you're asking yourself, well, why should I go through the extra expense and the extra time to do this? Well, what will happen is simply this. It will cause a lot of pain, and by pain I define that as a rejected shipment. If a shipment is sent out and they receive it in, they notice that there are no IUID labels on those assets, they're not going to accept the shipment, which is going to cause a delay in payments. So first and foremost, it's affecting your revenue stream because you don't have the compliance labels on those assets. They could also reject the shipment altogether. So picture FedEx is picking up the assets to ship to ABC, and the receiver has rejected the shipment altogether. Now you have FedEx calling you, asking you, what do I do with this? I attempt to deliver it. They are not accepting it. Now FedEx is holding on to these assets, more than likely charging you storage fees. And one way or the other, those items have to get to the end user. So there's really no getting around this. If you don't do it, again, delayed payments, rejected shipments, then there's the reputation of your company. If the government is finding that you're not following the compliance requirements, you're going to jeopardize future contracts with them because they've ran into issues in the past with non-compliance. Mm-hmm. The other issue is you've got to take corrective action to get it fixed. You have outstanding shipments out there. They won't receive them in until they have those proper labels. So you have that added cost of not only getting the labels, but having them placed on. They could possibly back charge you if they have to mark these labels themselves. If you send the labels directly to them, well, can you do this for me? They'll probably back charge you. So there's all these additional costs and additional headaches that can be easily avoided by simply ordering the labels right up front, especially when the contract clearly calls out MIL-STD 130 or the DFARS clause.
Okay. Well, and I've also seen a number of times that organizations will contact us and say, well, if you have this clause in there, tell us what you want us to do, right? And that's a pretty dangerous and slippery slope because if you're waiting on the government to tell you what to do, it still is in your contract. It's part of the FAR clause. And if you are dragging your heels on it for any reason, that also can come back to haunt you because any shipments going out in the meanwhile aren't conforming, right?
Correct. Yeah. You know, the other thing I want to mention too, there's also the potential that if you're being audited and they find non-compliance, you could be issued what is called a PQDR, which is a product quality deficiency report. Mm. And it's basically a warning stating that, hey, you failed on this particular requirement, you need to take corrective action for it. And when you're trying to win additional contracts with the government, they're going to look at your performance history. And if they see that PQDRs have been issued against you, you know, that's certainly going to hurt your chances of winning additional contracts versus another company who has a clean record, who's followed the compliance requirement.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, good points. Good points. All right. Here's a good question that we just received also in, Dan. It's how do we know where to place the IUID label on the asset?
Ooh, that's a very good question, Peter. The main thing you want to do is when you're applying the label, first and foremost, you want to apply it to a flat, clean, smooth surface if at all possible. Some surfaces may have caulk paint. That should be noted because some of these labels, when you're applying them to caulk painted surfaces, they need a special adhesive so that they can adhere to that type of surface. Maybe the surface is not a flat, smooth surface, and maybe it's a little rigid or whatever the case may be. You may need a thicker adhesive to kind of fill in the gaps so you have a complete seal against that surface. So once you've established that, where do you put the label? You need to put the label in a place that's easily accessible where you can scan that barcode. You certainly don't want to put it in a place where you can't get a scanner in there to read that barcode, because that's going to jeopardize the compliance as well. So an easily
also, I've seen that a lot of products get made with a pre-existing data plate, manufacturer's plate that typically goes on it, and so I'd emphasize a label or a plate that could be either included in that data plate or in and around that area, which is a logical place to put an IUID.
Absolutely.
Another good question, comes in, Dan. For the marking requirement, the question reads, is it true that within the DFARS clause, the contracting officer should clarify which specific assets should be tracked? And when they say tracked, I assume they mean, identified and marked and reported, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. There are other things. That there's the old standbys in terms of what should or shouldn't be marked. There is obviously items that are valued over $5,000, items that are serially managed, mission critical items, and any items that are controlled inventory should all be marked with an IUID label.
But should the specific I think what this person is asking is, should the specific part numbers, for instance, be called out specifically within the contract clause in order to, initiate the action on their end to mark the asset?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I agree. I think that's an important aspect of this as well, is that, when considering the asset identification for end items going out, always go back to your contracts and either get clarity to which parts need to be marked or make sure that they're specifically called out, and I would encourage it by part number.
Yeah. The safest way, Peter, absolutely, is to call out the part number using that construct 2 format on end items, no question.
Yes, okay. Also, when it comes to property marking and reporting, government property that's in custody, that might be government furnished property, GFP, it is the de facto standard that any items, regardless of value now, that are in the category of all those categories you mentioned, Dan, should be identified, marked, and reported to the IUID registry, right?
Correct.
And so for property, it's a little different than those end items being shipped out, in that you already have the assets inside your custody, and if you're reporting them, now they need to be marked, because IUID has now subsequently become the new not only marking standard but reporting standard, because the government wants that kind of granularity about their assets.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Good. Here's another question, just to clarify, a clarifying question. It is our understanding that IUID is only required when the DFARS clause is present, right?
Absolutely. 252, 211, 7003. Memorize that clause. Anywhere in the contract, immediately, that's your identifier for IUID compliance.
That's the cue. And this is an interesting point that might need some clarification, but just MIL Standard 130 is bag and tag only. And if I take the literal read of that, then the answer is no.
Correct.
Right? Because MIL Standard, there could very well be a bag and tag situation if you can't put a physical mark on an item where you put it in a bag, you tag the bag itself. But I'd say more often than not, we don't run across a lot of bag and tag situations.
That, without question, Peter, that is the exception, the rare exception, and certainly not the rule. A typical MIL Standard 130 or DFARS 211-7003 requirement, you're applying the label directly to the individual asset.
Okay.